Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Anton Howes. Anton is an historian, and more precisely, he describes himself as an historian of innovation with a special focus on the Industrial Revolution. And I think most of you will know Anton from his massively popular substack called The Age of Invention. I honestly don't think there is another substacker or blogger or historian out there who has made me think more about, quite literally, the nuts and bolts of history. But today we're not going to talk about the Industrial Revolution as such. We're going to take a bit of a diversion from that, and we're going to look at the history of salt. Anyway, welcome, Anton, to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
So before we get on to the subject of salt, though, could you just take a moment to tell us what you mean when you call yourself an historian of innovation? I mean, what is your basic project?
Sure. When I started looking at the Industrial Revolution, I very quickly realized that the main thing that everyone actually wants to explain is not how do you get economic growth, which was kind of my starting point. It's actually how do you get the thing that underlies economic growth, or at least modern economic growth, this kind of continuous 1 to 2 to 3% per year annual economic growth, which is essentially technological development. So it's innovation. And you go from this period in history where basically there's occasional inventions, there's occasional innovations, but very little on the whole is happening, to suddenly in around, I used to say the 18th century, in around the 16th to 17th centuries, suddenly the pace of innovation starts to quite rapidly increase. And not just in a few small sectors, but in everything. Agriculture, watchmaking, everything in between, landscape gardening, pottery, ceramics, furniture making, mining different metals, whatever you can think of, there seems to be more and more innovation taking place. And that's really the thing that I got very excited about. And the thing I realized is that if I call myself an economic historian, then you start to get into all these debates about how much exact, amount of revenue is collected in such and such a year, or, what's the precise GDP that we need to be worrying about. And if you start talking about historians of technology, usually the thing that's kind of in vogue right now amongst most historians of technology will be social effects. It's not about how these things are actually created in the first place, but how they're used in society, how they're used amongst workers. Sometimes there'll be a little bit about the invention itself, but that's kind of secondary. And so when I thought about what it is that I actually care about the most, it's always, this always comes, and maybe it comes through in all my work, is origins. I'm obsessed with origins. I like to know how things begin. I'll spend 80% of the time writing any piece precisely on the origins bit, because that's the bit that I'm always interested in, is, where does this particular idea come from? Where does this particular bit of inspiration come from? Where does this particular invention come from? And so I've become obsessed with inventions, how it is that people come up with these very new ways of doing things that ultimately, right, in the past few hundred years have completely transformed our world, right? We've gone from a few hundred years ago having lives that are pretty similar to a few hundred years before, to having lives that today would be completely unrecognizable to someone just a few hundred years ago.
So what's the difference? Because you said that society got more and more innovative, but it got more and more innovative before the Industrial Revolution kicked off. So it seems to me like without the Industrial Revolution, we're still poor. And yet you had all this innovation. So does all the innovation lead to the Industrial Revolution? What's the connection?
Yes. So ultimately, by finding ways to do more things with less or more things with the same, finding better ways to do things, that's, I think, ultimately the cause of all of that economic growth, right? So when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we maybe have ideas in mind about this sort of Dickensian hellscape full of coal and cotton and steam and big smoking chimneys. Yeah. When I think of the Industrial Revolution, when most economic historians think about the Industrial Revolution, what they're thinking of is they're thinking about kind of a certain amount of growth per year that takes place over the course of the 18th, 19th centuries and really kind of gets going from there. They think about modern economic growth. And really, part of the problem is that the term Industrial Revolution, it's even quite difficult to say quite quickly, is one of these sort of hangovers from the late 19th, early 20th centuries that we're sort of stuck with, because everyone kind of they've heard of it. And so it's always the term that everyone uses about this period or about this subject matter. But really, it's one of those. It's a bit like Voltaire on the Holy Roman Empire. Neither holy nor Roman nor really an empire. The Industrial Revolution is neither because it's actually lots of things. It's not that industrial because it's actually all things: agricultural, services, industrial, you name it. And it's not even that much of a revolution because it's actually quite gradual, a process that seems to come about as a result of these incremental changes. Really, the thing I care about, I guess, then is the bit that actually matters about the Industrial Revolution, which I think is what you might call an acceleration of innovation, which is a very clunky, kind of annoying thing to say. And I'd love, if listeners can come up with a better term for acceleration of innovation, where it's something that covers all industries, all areas of activity, all at the same time, has that kind of gradualism, has that incrementalism, then I'll be very, very impressed, because I've spent quite a few years thinking about it and have come up short.
It's not really comparable, but it does seem to me that there's certain times in history, and the bits that I know are some things like, about 100 years, 150 years, 100 years in ancient Greece, where there's sudden explosion, with philosophy, theatre, science, mathematics, political thought, just this incredible explosion. And then you've maybe got the Renaissance, you've maybe got, to take a parochial example, the time of Shakespeare, where all of a sudden there's this huge explosion of creativity in England. So are there some periods which somehow are more creative than others? And is there any rhyme or reason? Is there any sense to that?
Yeah, so in the economic history literature, and I think this is broadly right. I need to kind of look into a lot of them in a bit more detail, but I think this is broadly right. There's a term coined by historian Jack Goldstone of efflorescences. Mm. So these sort of bubblings up, exactly what you described: Renaissance Italy, the Dutch Golden Age, perhaps, Sung Dynasty China. There's certain periods in parts of the Islamic world in between the 8th and 13th centuries, which is a bit broad, but actually there are, if you actually zoom in, there are actually even smaller, more specific decades or centuries where things are going on. These bubblings up of activity, of creativity. And one way of looking at the Industrial Revolution in Britain is that it's the efflorescence that kept going, that has never stopped, right? We're still living through the effects of it. You put the Alka-Seltzer into the water, the fizz keeps going, and it just endlessly starts fizzing upon itself, right? So that's one way of looking at the Industrial Revolution. I must say that's kind of the way I've looked at it for... Now that you've asked the question, I'm thinking to myself, that is the way I have traditionally looked at it, but maybe it's not actually the way that I look at it anymore, which is that there do seem to be often contingent things with a lot of those earlier efflorescences. And in England, you mentioned the age of Shakespeare. I think that's actually the age in which England is already starting to look quite unusual. There's already some pretty interesting things happening economically that haven't actually happened before, in terms of the wholesale shift of the economy towards a new way of operating. So to give you a few examples, London goes from being basically a pretty large city, but nothing that special, of about 50,000 people in the early 16th century. So really, I don't think it would even make it into the top 10 of European cities. It's somewhere in the top 20 maybe, but considering there aren't that many national capitals, top 20 is actually really not that great. And then by 1600, it's already about 200,000 people. So it's already quadrupled in size. So that's, in Shakespeare's London, is already something actually quite unusual. And then by 1700, it's 575,000 people, which is the closest estimate. So it's already pushing on to being the largest city in the entire world. And that's really kind of interesting, that when we think of the Industrial Revolution, when we think of that periodization, we think of the 18th century as being where all the action is. But the thing I've realized over the last few years is that increasingly it's actually about this pre-1700 period, where actually everything that happens post-1700 is kind of just, we mentioned efflorescences, there's a bit the fizz eating on itself, fizzing upon itself. That's just the continuation of a trend that's already started getting into going. I think in the mid-16th century, right? I think there's a very clear point in around the 1540s and 50s where England goes from being a proper backwater, and I've just written a section of my book manuscript, which is all about just how much backwater England is, because I think people don't really appreciate. They always
Right.
back project their ideas of Britain back onto the past. They think, oh yeah, it's always ruled the waves. It's always, been an island that's secure. I mean, none of these things are actually true pre-1540s, pre-1550s. And then goes through an extraordinary crisis, a series of crises, plague, famine, multiple coups, which people don't even really historically think of as coups nowadays. All of these problems. And comes out of it by the 1570s, 80s, a completely transformed country. One that is very much geared towards growth, that's very much geared towards innovation, is geared towards naval power, to trade, long-distance trade, and making the most of all of those things. And I think all of those aspects of it start building upon one another pretty quickly. And so I think in the 17th century, you can really talk about it as being more than just an efflorescence. You've got the growth of London. You've got this huge shift of people out of agriculture and into industry in a way that hasn't happened anywhere else. I mean, I've really searched and I've not found anything comparable to both those things prior to that happening. And so I think already England is starting to look extremely interesting, extremely unusual. And frankly, I'm amazed that most people aren't focusing on that period and having the big debate about that rather than the 18th century.
But I'm sort of a bit puzzled by this because the 1600s is what you're talking about. I get very confused. People talk about the 17th century and you have to remind yourself, oh, no, we mean the 1600s.
Yeah, I've gotten really used to it. And I need to, I should, when I think 1600s, though, I worry that it's the decade 1600 to 1609, it's...
Okay, we're talking about 1600s, 17th century. And this is a time where... I mean, for example, Charles is trying to raise taxes and he can't.
Yes.
They won't let him. And the English Navy, famously, is unable to defend us against the Barbary corsairs. We're still not that powerful.
So I would say we shouldn't mistake the weakness of the crown with the weakness of the country.
Right.
And I would actually say one thing I've kind of noticed is that in the late 16th century and early 17th century, possibly one of the things that makes England what it is the fact that the crown is so powerless. Having gone from in the early 60s, so yeah, I'll translate all these. Having gone from the reign of Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, where you end up with an extremely unprecedentedly heavy-handed state. I mean, huge amounts of taxation, basically hadn't been seen for over 100 years, huge amounts of uncertainty about property rights, especially in the 1530s. Literally the mass expropriation of all monasteries and chantries and, various other things that people had thought were secure, as well as the undermining of people's normal private property rights as well, in terms of what they thought was secure land titles. And
sorry, how did their land get expropriated? I thought that was just the monasteries that got expropriated.
Okay. Readers had better buckle in for a real tangent here. I had no idea about this until just a few months ago.
A tangent of a tangent.
This is a tangent of a tangent of a tangent, which is par for the course for me. Is that the expression? Anyway, in the 1530s, actually, I'll wind back even a bit more. In the 15th century, a tax dodge was developed to get around the fact that if you were a nobleman, and you held land from the king. I mean, one thing to bear in mind here is that since the Norman conquest of 1066, the king is the ultimate landlord of all land in the entire country. Right? But that's actually quite important because anyone who is, you say the Duke of Norfolk or some such, anyone who's a lord is actually technically a tenant of the king. And as part of being a tenant of the king, there are various tenants' obligations towards him. So every time the tenant dies, the heir has to pay various feudal taxes or dues. They have to, if they die before their own heir is of age, then the king gets to basically manage the land until the orphan, comes to the age of 21. which I think is what's considered of age at the time, which in practice means that they just lend it out to all their cronies who completely, trash the place, cut down all the wood. It's like complete disaster a lot of the time for whoever is called a ward of the crown. You've got all these basically extremely onerous, effectively inheritance taxes, right? And in order to get around them, in the late 14th century, early 15th century, a lot of people come up with a get around, which is that what they can do is they can give the land to a trust, an immortal trust which will never die and thus never trigger these inheritance taxes. This is really a tangent, but I think bear with me. Like I'm saying to listeners, bear with me. It's really worth it because your mind will be blown by how bad Henry VIII was. You give your land to a trust, and the trust will give you the use of the land, firstly to the person who's just given it to the trust, right? And then to all of their heirs in perpetuity. And you can kind of set up the trust and set up the conditions of these uses. And in practice, the person who's given it over to the trust, they can start making wills, which is not something that people could do before, right? They can't just say, I'm going to give 50% to such and such, child, and then another 50% to my favourite daughter, and all these other kind of things that you can start doing with your own land. Now, over the course of the 15th century, that becomes normal, and basically all land in the country goes through at some point someone setting up this and doing something with uses. And obviously you've got transactions and people, a lot of the land changes hands between different effectively tenants of the king and tenants and subtenants and subtenants, and basically all land is affected by this until and at the same time the crown tries to crack down on the very few people who don't make use of this tax dodge, right? So they try to really get their money's worth from these feudal incidents, or as they're called, or feudal dues, wardship, and then there's all sorts of various other kind of. They sound extremely finicky, but they're a really big deal at the time. And until in the 1530s, Henry VIII turns around and goes, I don't like this. You've been tax dodging for well over 100 years. I want my due from all land again. And he threatens explicitly. I mean, it's amazing when you go and read, what he says to Parliament. He says, if you don't sort this out, I'm not going to forget it, and I'm going to come and get my revenge. I mean, Is
this Henry VIII, or is this his thug Cromwell?
Oh, no, it's Henry VIII himself, as far as I'm aware. And what happens is that he leans on the judges, and I remember reading something about this where he not only asks the judges for their opinion, and they give him the wrong opinion, so he assembles them again. And this time, half the judges are his own appointees anyway. The other half are from beforehand. One of the potential dissenters, mumbles so quietly that they record it as just being, in the affirmative, even though who knows what he actually said. But basically the judges kind of go, okay, the use of uses, this kind of use of the trust and then all this tax dodge is illegal. Which, if you think about it, considering all land in the entire country, everyone's property relations with one another, it'd be a bit like if today you said, oh, you know what, leasehold. So for listeners, people who live in the UK, there's freehold where you kind of own the land yourself, and there's leasehold where technically there's a freeholder who's actually your landlord, even though you pay a peppercorn rent. Imagine if all leasehold was suddenly just declared illegal tomorrow, that every person's, the hundreds of thousands, millions that they've been paying for their houses, or that the title to their property was suddenly was kind of called into question. That's a huge deal. And then in the next Parliament, funnily enough, Parliament votes to give Henry VIII huge taxes, even though they're not at war.
Right.
And then immediately afterwards, they pass what's called the Statute of Uses, where they effectively declare, and remember, the king has to give his assent to all laws, right? It's not just the Commons, the Lords. The king then actually needs to say, yep, I approve the law. As part of the quid pro quo, they vote him taxes, and then he approves the Statute of Uses, which is to essentially say that any property transaction up to now has been valid. amnesty, if you like, for hundreds of years, over 100 years. And then for every transaction going forward to start levying this tax again. So essentially the restoration of actual feudalism, which had been in abeyance for over 100 years, right, during the Wars of the Roses and all these other things for ages and ages and ages. Now, in the 1540s, that's weakened again because there's a statute called the Statute of Wills, where effectively, again, because Henry VIII is always short of cash. He's always fighting lots of wars, spending far more quickly than he can raise the cash. He always needs things up front. I mean, the same with the dissolution of the monasteries. They seize all the monasteries completely illegally.
And this is just a cash grab, you reckon?
It's just a cash grab. It's cash grab after cash grab after cash grab after cash grab. That is the entire reign of Henry VIII, is cash grab. All of this stuff that could have been built into the foundations, the pillars of absolutism for future kings, is all just expended immediately for the next cash grab. And so the Statute of Wills effectively allows people to not have to I think it's about 40%, or maybe it's just 50%. I can't remember exactly. I need to go and double check. That's the problem with podcasts. I can never have it right to hand. But a very big proportion of it basically allows them to actually will as they will, as they want. And then the rest will be taxable. So he effectively reduces the tax burden so that he can get, again, money voted to him up front. So that's your tangent. Is the statute of uses, the undermining of property rights. I mean, no one's ever heard of this, right? People kind of hear of the statute of uses. But when I looked into it, I was like, this is insane. I mean, it's completely insane, unprecedented thing that no one's ever really heard of, but was, absolutely huge at the time. People must have been, there's no surprise that all of the stuff with the dissolution and the Reformation, was passed through, considering they had that hanging over their heads.
I'm completely confused now because Henry VIII is obviously, and I guess his daughter Elizabeth were obviously strong monarchs able to bend Parliament to their will. But by the time of Charles, your point is, okay, Charles may have been unable to bend Parliament to his will, but that's not to say that England is not a strong country. Have I got that right?
Yes, but I would actually go further back a bit. I'm not sure Elizabeth is that strong a queen. If you look at the change because of the mid-century crises in the 1540s and 50s, I would say that by the time Elizabeth comes to power, part of the quid pro quo of accepting her as being a queen regnant in her own right? This is something that Mary kind of gets away with. She doesn't get to do because she marries Philip of Spain, who becomes Philip II. Elizabeth in her own right, one of the interesting things you see is that a lot of what we'd now call state capacity gets completely eroded away. So to give you one example, and I think this is, again, something that I've never seen really commented on, but I think is an absolutely huge deal. During Henry VIII's reign, they introduced oaths for the commissioners who collected taxes, which means that when Henry VIII collected taxes in the 1510s, the 20s, 40s, they're a really big deal. People are paying huge amounts of their capital wealth. It's a capital tax, not an income tax, at least if you're a merchant. It's an income tax if you're a landlord and you receive more through rent. But they're paying huge amounts of capital and they're swearing oaths, which they take extremely seriously considering how religious society was at the time. And they're raising absolutely vast amounts of money. In Elizabeth's reign, very early in her reign, I think in 1563, Parliament changes the rules. And again, this is not something that I think would have been given up lightly. Parliament changes the rules and no longer requires oaths from the commissioners. And lo and behold, over the course of Elizabeth's reign, tax receipts absolutely plummet. There's almost comical levels of tax evasion, with the assessors effectively saying that some of the richest people in the country are worth barely £100 when they're actually worth tens of thousands of pounds by their own accounts. Right? And this is even common knowledge. People in Parliament are mentioning it and saying, maybe we should try and kind of reform this. And it just completely is an unsolved issue for the rest of, pretty much for the rest of English history until, kind of modern bureaucracies start being set up again, or really after Charles I and the Protectorate starts introducing entirely new ways of doing things. So that you have this period between the 1540s and the 1640s, where actually about 100 years, where the monarchy is extremely weak. And the reason I think that's important is not kind of from a kind of more obvious classical liberal libertarian kind of point of view. It's actually that in terms of support for growth for invention, there isn't an obvious patron. And so a lot of the ways, because the monarch frankly can't afford that much. And so nearly all of the things that England comes up with that are extremely interesting and really leans on, even if they don't come up with it originally, but really lean on, is things that allow the monarch to do things, or the government to do things, that don't require any cash and that raise capital privately from private investors. So their use of patents, their use of corporations, a lot of that is about basically doing things on the cheap from the monarch's perspective, but from an innovation perspective, from an economic policy perspective, are extremely useful, because what they do is they kind of create this very, very broad groundswell, if you like, of potential sources of support for invention, for economic growth.
I'm sort of completely lost now as to where we're going, but I did, coming back to this periods of efflorescence,
yes,
as you call it, and then there are periods in history where it just seems to be that everything is dead. And I'm not talking about, what are, the historians get very cross if you talk about the Dark Ages, but I sort of think England in the 500s. That's not a bad name for
yeah.
but I'm talking about the enormously sophisticated Romans, and it seems to be in a period. Obviously, it's very difficult to get back and know what was really going on then. What were the trading networks? How sophisticated were their banks and lending mechanisms? But if you go back to the time of Augustus, and the emperors, 100, 200, 300, 400 AD, you would think that with all the wealth, with all the peace, that this would be a period of huge innovation. And people sometimes say, well, why no industrial revolution in Roman times? So do you just want to, I don't know when we're going to get to salt, but do you want to spend 5 minutes just talking us through why some periods seem to be particularly dead, and also why no Roman industrial revolution?
I think there is quite a bit of growth during the Roman Empire, or the early Republic.
I'm not talking about growth so much.
But yes, sure.
It's not so much growth, it's more intellectual. I don't know quite what I'm trying to get at, but I suppose innovation. But maybe there was innovation, I don't know.
I suspect there's quite a great deal more than we know about, is the first thing I'd say. I suspect there's quite a great deal more than we know about. A lot of new or more recent archaeological finds do seem to find larger and larger mills, more and more sophisticated machinery. So I do wonder if there's a lot more going on that we're not as aware of. And maybe that kind of, in a way, is kind of even more depressing, because it shows the sheer scale of the collapse, right? Is that it's actually really quite sophisticated and collapses. I mean, one of the things, and I will say there is something to mention about growth, is that you can get a lot of what appears to be an efflorescence, I think, just from kind of economies of scale. Right, so if you have the Pax Romana and you have the entire Mediterranean basically a pirate-free zone, where you've got all this kind of flourishing of trade, you are just naturally going to get quite a bit of cross-pollination of ideas. You're going to get a bit more specialization. You're going to get the division of labor. So there is going to be quite a bit of what may appear, I think, maybe at first sight, as being invention, innovation just through that. I mean, the reality in terms of why not Rome is, the thing I keep leaning towards is that actually, if you look at what we know about what the Romans achieved, they had a much larger hill, a much steeper hill to climb than I think we appreciate, right? As far as I know, they didn't have spinning wheels.
Even Augustus's wife, Livia, is never seen outside the house except with a spindle on her finger.
Right. So this is really basic stuff. I mean, spinning wheels aren't that advanced. They're a medieval invention, as far as I know. And again, I haven't looked at it in detail, but, to make the jump from spindle to spinning wheel is, I think, maybe actually much more difficult than the jump from the spinning wheel to the spinning jenny. So in terms of the scale of improvements and a lot of marginal stuff that's going to be taking place along the way, it's possible that you just need more time for it to get to that kind of stage. And there's a lot of other industries about which I think that can be said. Again, with metallurgy, I think there's quite a few alloys that they seem to have been completely unaware of. But even spinning, I think, it sounds like a small thing to focus on today when you think, oh yeah, clothes, whatever, that's just a small part of the economy. At the time, that's a very, very big deal. I mean, we're talking about one of the basic necessities after food is essentially clothing. And then fuel, I guess, is kind of the only other thing that's right up there. So warmth and food. So if you can't even get some of your really basic stuff done to do with saving labour when it comes to textile making, that really limits how much you can free up for other things beyond that. Which is why I think it takes a great deal more effort to get past it. Now, I think the other thing to look at, of course, is why is it the Roman Empire falls at all? I'm not an expert on the period, so I won't hazard into such dangerous waters.
Well, I think everybody says the smart answer to that question is always, it's just amazing it lasted as long as it did. Emperors all collapse. This is in the nature of political entities.
Yeah, but even if that weren't the case, you'd expect there to have been powerful states to have taken over from it, potentially, which could have kept at least the torch going regionally rather than over the entire continent.
Arguably, that is what happened. Amongst historians, they get very cross when you call it the Byzantine Empire, but everybody knows what you mean by that.
Oh, is that not proper anymore? Is that?
Not anymore, because they make the point that that's a back projection, and at the time they regarded themselves as Romans.
Right.
So they now call it the East Roman Empire. And I think that's fair. That is what they called themselves. And I think that Byzantine or Byzantine does have negative connotations, which these historians are trying to get rid of, because I think a lot of people, Gibbon famously, despised the Byzantines. So I think they're trying to sort of say, no, that's not the way to look at them. Look at them as East Romans.
Maybe that's the bigger question, actually, is why doesn't the East Roman Empire have an industrial revolution, right? It survives. It carries the torch. I mean, maybe let's count it up to the 13th century when the Venetians invade and sack Constantinople, right? Let's take that as an endpoint. But why is it even so weak for that to be able to happen in the first place, right? That maybe is a big one.
Well, the argument, this is like, I don't know if you've ever seen the film The Saragossa Manuscript, but it has about 8 levels where people are having dreams about having dreams, in which somebody tells somebody a story. The story is about someone who has a dream, and Anyway, so we're at multiple tangents, but one reason that the Venetians were able to knock it over was that the emperor was incompetent, and instead of patching up the defences and bringing back the armies from the frontiers and getting ready, by the time the Venetians arrived, and he had time to sort of prepare, but when they arrived, he had not much other than militias to push them back, and when you're faced with angry French knights and Venetians, that's maybe not quite enough. Now, where are we? Okay, so we've failed miserably to answer why there was. Well, I guess no. I don't think that's fair. I think you have answered why there's no Roman Revolution. Your Roman Industrial Revolution. Your argument is that they're more backward and they've got further to go than we perhaps appreciate. So okay, here's another tangent. When the Portuguese arrive in Japan or off the coast of Japan, and they meet the Japanese for the first time, and they say, oh, maybe you haven't seen one of these before. And they show them a musket, and the Japanese say, oh, that's very interesting. And they take it away, and they sort of disassemble it. And then within 6 months, they're turning them out in large numbers. So I guess my question is if the Portuguese of the 1500s had, pitched up on the shores of the Roman Empire and said, oh, I wonder if you've seen one of these before, and shown them a musket. Would the Romans have been turning out muskets by the boatload?
I suspect so. I mean, the closest analogy I can think of, and again, I don't know my ancient history that well, but in I think it's before the Second Punic War, maybe it's actually the Third Punic War. I'm getting them mixed up because of BC AD. No, I think before, is it just after the First Punic War, maybe during the First Punic War, that Carthaginian ships accidentally beached on Italian shores, or something happens that they basically get access to the ships, and within a year or something they're mass producing, and they basically worked out how to do naval power, having never really done it before. I think muskets are pretty similar. That's very, very similar. I mean, the more interesting question would be, if a British ship from the 18th century turns up, and can that be copied? Because clearly, from what happens in the 18th century and especially the 19th century, it's not that easy, right? There seem to be so many more levels beyond that you are ahead that it becomes extremely difficult to copy. As far as I understand it, I mean, one of the big issues is that you can copy things exactly, but actually it's to do with the fineness of the powder, of the gunpowder. It's to do with the range finding techniques. It's to do with, a lot of the kind of mathematics and geometry that goes behind how that goes behind the ballistics that ends up being the actually really important stuff for operating certain technologies, and then becomes very, very difficult to replicate because the knowledge is no longer embodied in the physical item itself.
I'm quite keen to do a podcast sometime on the Opium War with China, and I forget the name of the man, Tonio something.
Tonio Andrade.
Yeah, that's right. I'm quite keen to sort of find out about that because obviously the British were able to brush aside the Chinese quite easily, and yet the Chinese were, until just a few years prior to that, probably the greatest, most sophisticated civilization, the world had ever seen, and yet they were just brushed aside as if they were nothing by this, fairly small power operating from the other side of the world. It's quite astonishing.
I mean, you even see that in a much earlier period. I mean, one thing about the Spanish Armada is that a lot of people think of it as being, I think the most common thing that people think about the Spanish Armada is, there's a big storm and that kind of disperses it, and happy England, it's a kind of lucky chance. That, as far as I'm aware, is not now the consensus amongst the experts. The consensus among the experts is now that actually it is very much a naval engagement, which the English completely dominate the Spanish in. And I've seen quite a bit of the correspondence amongst because I've looked into it a little bit, because it's relevant to what I've been writing recently, but a lot of the Spanish are kind of incredulous at the range of English guns, the rapidity of firing, the tactics, the kinds of ships that they're coming across. I mean, the English had completely changed the way that they were going to do warfare, moving away from these kind of essentially floating castles and having something where you're trying to get the height advantage like you would on land. You want to get the hill so you can fire down on people, and effectively have transport armies onto the sea and then have a big battle on the sea, to doing something where you're actually focusing on holding the ships as much as possible. You're focusing on broadsides. You're going as low and sleek to the water as you possibly can. And they're using guns in such, not just quality, but also in such numbers, because they're just churning them out in a way that they hadn't really done before. So there's almost a kind of technological dominance element there, which I think is very quickly caught up with, but it shows just how these kind of slight advantages can have a very big impact before everyone kind of realizes the new information.
It kind of ties in a little bit with what you were saying about how weak or how much weaker Elizabeth is than we perhaps give it credit for, because although as proud British subjects, we all remember the Spanish Armada, with great pleasure. What tends to get forgotten a little bit is that there was an English Armada the next year that sails off to Spain. And, it's
Portugal, right? I think it's...
Is it? Okay, but it's given very clear instructions. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to go and burn all the Spanish ships which have limped back. You're going to do this, you're going to do that. And all the captains sort of salute Elizabeth and say, yes, of course. And then they sail off. They don't do it at all. They go to completely different places. They waste all their time. And it's just a complete shambles and a disaster.
Repeatedly as well, throughout the whole 1580s and 90s.
Right.
Her orders, explicit orders, are repeatedly just completely ignored by the men on the ground.
There's something that's interesting about sea power, because I was looking into this a little bit with Giles Milton and looking at all these expeditions that were sent out. I can't remember, is it John Cabot or whatever, and he's given instructions as to where he's to go. And he sails literally 180 degrees in a different direction. And basically, once you're out of sight of land, you can do what you like. It's quite...
I think we'll see that again, by the way. I wrote a piece ages ago, which were not one of my best ones, but I think we're going to get this very soon with space travel. and you really see it a little bit, those up there can do certain things that those on the ground can't make the call. And they there's a time lag, there's all this other stuff. But when the time lag gets really big, I mean, when we're talking days instead of seconds, which, happens pretty quickly considering the kind of distance. I mean, a Mars colony, let's say, is really going to have a big time lag. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's quite long. Those on the ground up there, up in space, are going to be able to do all sorts of things that back home they're going to be. And it's it's extremely similar to 17th, 16th, 17th, even 18th century, naval stuff, in that you send people off with like this extremely, extremely expensive equipment. I mean, eye-wateringly expensive equipment, and they just come back, and you just hope for the best, that they do exactly what you told them to.
I think that's okay, so long as they pay their tea taxes. That's all that matters. So where did I want to go from that? Okay, so what should we do? We're an hour in, and we haven't actually got started. So
there's your title. I think it's about the podcast, not about salt.
What do you want to do? Do you want to finish it there? Do you want to do a salt podcast now? Do you want to take a rain check? What do you want to do?
No, ask me more questions. Go on.
So we had a slight digression at the start, but not to worry. We're going to get back on track, Anton. I don't want you to feel like you've been brought here under false pretenses. So let's talk about salt. So who cares about salt? Why is it important historically?
I think salt is one of the most underrated. I mean, despite the fact there's an extremely popular book about the world history of salt by Mark Kolansky, I think salt is still one of the most underrated commodities that historically we've produced. But I think it comes right after agriculture and just the basics of growing wheat, bread, making bread, tending livestock, and so on. In that, if you think about the most important things historically, it's about how you feed yourself, how you clothe yourself, how you keep yourself warm. And salt is a kind of general purpose technology when it comes to food, because it makes all your food taste better. It preserves all your food and makes it last long. And so in terms of just the sheer efficiency of agriculture, adding even a tiny bit of salt can make an absolutely huge impact on that. It's very easy to forget that because salt is so common nowadays to the extent that, vast quantities of it we literally throw on our roads just to keep some ice away. We just scatter this stuff like it's, salt, I guess. It's like extremely valueless stuff. Whereas you go back even just a few hundred years and people are talking about salt in a much more precious way. It's something that's they talk about the potential of salt in agriculture, which a lot of people find very surprising. And they say, but we just can't afford to use that much because there's no way that you could justify the expense of it.
But you say salt makes food taste better. Is that it, or do you need salt?
On an ultimate level, you do need salt to survive. You won't. It's pretty gruesome what happens if you don't have salt. I looked into this a little bit because it makes for a kind of compelling paragraph. But if you don't have salt, effectively your organs start to swell up with fluid, and I guess you die from the swelling. You need it as just to regulate your bodily functions, basic bodily functions, at least in kind of minimal amounts. And so salt is a necessity. But there are lots of sources of salt that you can maybe get around, this kind of absolute basic death problem.
You can get just enough to survive.
You can often get just enough to survive. Although I will say that even beyond just being a basic necessity, you do need a decent amount of salt to sustain activity, right? So cognitive activity, thinking hard, working hard, especially if you're sweating a lot and you're losing a lot of sweat, and you're losing a lot of salt through sweat, you do need to replenish that. And so salt can often be quite a significant limiter on the amount of basic kind of use of muscle power. And I think that's one way of thinking about, when we think about the pre-modern or early modern economies, we need to think about the fact that the main constraint is often on energy. And if you lack salt, it's a bit like if you lack some crucial ingredient that allows you to extract, I don't know, the nuclear power from uranium. It's a bit like not having the water, let's say, to drive the steam turbine that you're going to heat up. It's like you may have as much wheat as you like, but if you don't have the basic bit of salt, you're not going to have a very productive workforce. And so this, I think, could be a really, really big deal. Especially in places where you end up with severe limitations on salt artificially, either because you're very, very inland and you don't have access to inland salt sources as well as to the salty sea, but also where authorities can kind of impose restrictions on salt because it's something that's very, very good to tax.
I just want to bring you back because you said that using salt in agriculture, and I was sort of a bit surprised by that, because I think it's one thing that we all know is that when the Romans razed Carthage to the ground, they salted the earth so that nothing could grow there again. So it doesn't sound like that's terribly good for the agriculture.
So apparently that's not what it says. So the salting Carthage so that it never grows again seems to be a bit of a myth.
Oh, no.
I must say, I'm relying a bit on ancient historians to kind of tell the truth here. But as far as I'm aware, that is a complete myth. What you do have, though, is from earlier periods in the ancient world, cases where salt is sown along with some other kind of seed. Now, there are two theories here. One theory is that you salt the land so that your usual crops don't grow so well. And then you sow the seeds of stuff that's very, very resistant to salt, basically weeds, which will actually make it very, very difficult to use as farmland, because that stuff will thrive in the way that the stuff that you want to grow won't thrive by salting it. Frankly, though, I don't think that, and I mentioned salt is pretty valuable. Even if you've got a lot of access to this stuff.
It kind of feels like, I'm just trying to see all these wheelbarrows, if they had wheelbarrows in ancient times. just can't quite see how it's going to work.
It's completely ludicrous. I mean, ludicrous. The amount of salt that people were producing is nowhere close to what we now produce today, right? But salt does actually have certain properties where it does help quite a lot of plants. And I remember I posted about this. And I did actually make a small mistake in mixed up a reference, and then I'd also made a small mistake in this paragraph where I'd accidentally said that they had sown Carthage with salt when it turns out they hadn't sown it at all with salt, right? So that was the small mistake. But the principle of using salt in agriculture is one that people talk about a lot in the 16th, 17th, and even the 18th centuries as being something that could be very, very useful. And when I looked into it, it turns out there's actually quite a few studies from really just a few years ago, saying that it turns out that, and this is something that is almost never the case today, perhaps because salt in the environment is so much more plentiful, but I think will have been the case in the past, is that actually sodium and chloride, which is the kind of basic bits of salt, deficiencies are a thing in agriculture, right? They can affect plant growth, and you can, especially with certain kinds of crop, having a bit of salt, basic common salt, can actually improve yields under certain circumstances.
Right.
And what I suspect has happened is that because we literally put salt in we make so much and we literally just put it out in the environment, general levels of salt have increased quite dramatically over the past 100, 200 years. Whereas I think there are quite a few cases where it would have been more useful. I mean, even in the 70s and 80s, if you look up beet farming, they add salt. It turns out to be absolutely crucial to it. And that doesn't seem to be, based on mumbo jumbo, just silly beliefs. Like, there does actually seem to be something to it, because there are quite a few experiments made, especially near Cheshire, and people are using sea sand from the West Country, for example, and using it as a manure. They're not using it in the kind of traditional fertilizer way, which I think has to be, at least amongst agricultural theorists, has to be like one of the big nutrients. But sodium and chloride those ions are actually quite useful. They're kind of lesser, I guess you could call them lesser fertilizers. They're not like the big ones they're not the nitrogen or nitrates, whatever, that everyone's kind of so focused on today. But they are extremely useful.
So your piece on salt got me thinking about it a bit. And so I thought the most famous salt I could think of was that Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt back in the day. And I wondered, do you think that has why a pillar of salt? What was that about? Is it because Sodom was supposed to be in the Dead Sea? I'm just wondering, why a pillar of salt?
I have no idea. That's a very good question, because why would you turn them to something so valuable? It's I mean, it's a kind of a mixed punishment. It's like, oh, I've turned your wife into £1 million. What's
That's right. It's kind of push her over and carry her off. Well, you say it was valuable, but it really wasn't valuable because everybody else was dead. Because the only people who were allowed to leave Sodom was Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters. I actually went away and I Googled it because I thought, I don't really know about this story. And I was shocked to discover that because there's nobody left, Lot's daughters are saying, well, hang on, we're all going to die out. So what they do is they get Lot drunk and they get themselves pregnant with Lot, their father. I had absolutely no idea. And I'm thinking, well, this is extraordinary. The most virtuous people in Sodom who God has decided to save. And this is how it turns out.
It's like a Shakespearean tragedy, right? It's like this a tragicomedy. He kind of
I don't know. And then the other interesting thing about salt is that right up late into the 1800s, people believed that salt water didn't freeze, which completely mystifies me because you'd think it would be quite an easy experiment to do. But their idea was that when you saw these great chunks of ice in the sea, that was because it was near land and the water had been diluted. And so they had this idea that the North Pole was probably an ice-free zone because, of course, there was no land up there probably, and therefore you have salt water, which either it didn't freeze or it barely froze. Anyway, so that...
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, the Baltic froze quite a bit, right? You do get, which is a relatively saltless... Yeah.
All these rivers flowing in, so we don't need to think...
It's not a crazy idea when I think about the kinds of things that would have frozen up and that they've been able to say, oh, well, the Baltic freezes up, but there's loads of fresh water. It's extremely saltless. And then they would have looked at the Arctic and said, well, there must be a lot of just rivers around here that are going on. Because it was long thought, right, that the North Pole was also just a lake, right, and that there's...
Well, there was this theory that the Japan Current and the Gulf Stream kind of met at the top and that you would therefore have a lake. And the poor old Jeanette goes off and sort of sails into the ice pack and discovers after 2 years of being stuck there that this is complete
not
nonsense.
Quite true. Well, it's a bit like the belief that gold needed heat, which I think must have just been because... a lot of the gold they were mining would come from Africa, and they thought the hotter the country, the more gold, whereas silver would be kind of from the colder climes.
Okay, that's sort of but you would think by the late 1800s they would have worked it out, but people were ignorant that really quite late on. Anyway, let's crack on. So you mentioned tax earlier on, because I guess if everybody needs salt and it's bulky, but it's not that bulky. So presumably it's quite good to tax.
It's extremely good to tax. It is the main thing that basically almost every society has taxed. In fact, it's one of those things where when you find places that don't have some kind of salt tax or gabelle, which is the French term for it, when you don't find a place with a gabelle or a salt tax, it's actually noteworthy to people. They're like, "Oh my god, they don't have a salt tax? What are you talking about?" This is England is mentioned in that way in the 15th century as being they don't have a salt tax. Crazy. Whereas it's the easiest way that you have, given everyone needs a certain amount of salt, given all livestock needs a certain amount of salt, you can kind of have a bit of a poll tax and a tiny bit of a wealth tax in terms of people's movables, which can be quite difficult to tax because they can quite literally, move them out the way of the assessor. And so if you charge a certain amount just as a percentage fee on salt, in France, they go even further. They kind of literally make everyone buy a certain minimum quantity of salt, which they then charge them a certain amount.
That's harsh.
It's extremely harsh, at least in the lands of the Greater Gabelle, as it's called, which is kind of all around Paris and the northeast. Then it's a very, very simple way to essentially extract some revenue, and much easier than with food, right? It's, as you say, it's There's some bulk, but it's nowhere near as bulky as grain in terms of the amounts that we're talking about. But it's not quite so small that you can smuggle it like you could with gold and silver. So it's sort of it's that Goldilocks level of taxable commodities.
And I suppose also that well, how do you make salt? Because I'm thinking salt pans are not.
So there's a number of different ways. So you can do it directly from the sea. Obviously, so the sea is about, on average, 3.5% salt. There's a whole bunch of other stuff as well, but you can, if you're in a warm climate, you can just use the sun and the wind to evaporate away the water. Then there's a few other things that you can do to treat it, to take out what are called bitterns, which are the various other little chlorides and magnesium and blah, 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 that you find in salt water that make it taste quite literally bitter a lot of the time. So you can purify it as much as possible. Or you can extract it. I mean, sometimes you'll have salt springs under the ground, which is essentially ancient or prehistoric sea that has become trapped. And so fresh water flowing through it creates very, very salty water. And then that's often of much higher saline contents, can be up to about 15, 20% even.
And I guess it'd be much cleaner as well.
Significantly cleaner. And then sometimes if you're really lucky, you can actually find the rock itself that this fresh water has been going past, and you can mine it, and all you need to do is add a teeny tiny bit of water just to dissolve, just to kind of get the grit and other impurities out. And then that's the really, really clean stuff. So if you think your Himalayan rock salt or whatever, that's the kind of the least fuel intensive way of doing it. And that's the sort of thing that you can do even in colder climates where you haven't got the sun and wind to do all of that job for you. So those are your main ways. Two of them are basically inland. And I think actually makes a big, big difference even to the way that certain states formed in terms of just the sheer quantity and breadth of certain salt deposits. Otherwise, it's all to do with coastlines. But even with the coastlines, you can end up with some really interesting places where there's just so much fresh water coming in from rivers that you end up with such a higher level of fuel consumption required to make salt.
I want to talk a little bit about India, which you wrote about. I don't know. Did you ever see that documentary? It was a lovely film. There was no narrator. I don't think anybody actually said anything, as far as I can recall. It was about the salt plains in India at the little Rann of Kutch desert, and they pump up the water from below. They leave it just to dry, and then they hoover up the salt crystals. This film is called My Name is Salt, and it's absolutely remarkable. You see them at the end of the thing. Well, at the start of the film, they're sort of in this plain, and they start digging, and underneath what they find as they dig is all their equipment that they buried from the previous year. Wow. It's a wonderful film. It's called My Name is Salt.
I've not seen that.
If you get a chance, dig it out on YouTube or somewhere like that. But I was interested in it because it was in Western India.
Is that the Sampar Lake? Is that one of the?
I don't know. It's just the little Rann of Kutch desert.
I need to look it up.
And there is salt water underneath that they're able to pump up. But they can't do it during the monsoon because the whole place becomes completely flooded.
There's a similar thing in the Sampar Lake, which ends up being the main provider of salt in the late 19th, early 20th centuries for India. Because there's such sheer quantities. But it's a similar thing where it's a lake that kind of leaves these deposits that can then be mined and then kind of expands and contracts over time.
Well, maybe it's the same place, but maybe not. I don't exactly know. But you wrote about Bengal, and it was quite upsetting actually to read about because I'm a great believer in the goodness of all things British, and and every time I go into history, sort of my faith gets shaken just a little bit more. And this was a particularly egregious example. So do you want to can we maybe finish off just by explaining about what happened in Bengal?
So the interesting thing about Bengal is that there's so much fresh water coming from the Himalayas, from the Ganges, which comes all the way across India, from so many different rivers. Think of the Bengal Delta, right? There's just absolutely rivers. It's more river than it is land, almost. There's so much fresh water coming into that delta that the seawater immediately next to it and a little bit down the coast is extremely fresh. It's not quite as bad as the Baltic, which it turns out is even fresher. given how many rivers there are coming from Scandinavia and the Baltic, the kind of other states along it. But around Bengal, there's West Bengal, the province in India now, and then Bangladesh, which I guess as a whole used to be referred to as a separate province, Bengal. There's so much fresh water that you really don't have very much salt. And so historically, if you look at sources from the 16th century, they talk about basically that whole region just imported salt. They would take it all the way down the Ganges from the Sampar Lakes, which I mentioned earlier. That stuff would be carted over land to the Ganges and then sent all the way down the Ganges from kind of the interior of the central parts of the Mughal Empire around Agra, or it would come around the coast from the much hotter, drier bits that you have further south. And the other thing about Bengal is that not only, you might think, okay, fine, it doesn't have much salt and water, but it has plenty of sun. But it also has plenty of humidity, which actually makes it extremely difficult to evaporate, right? So you can't just use the heat of the sun and the wind to evaporate all this stuff. What you instead have to do is essentially cut down a lot of wood from the jungles along the coastline, near a lot of these kind of salt marshes, to do what's called sleeching, which is to wait for the high tides for those to recede, leaving behind their salt deposits in the sand, to purify that stuff and to use quite a lot of fuel cutting down all this wood to try and extract the salt from that. Now, the problem with sleeching is it's extremely labour intensive, isn't terribly productive. It's an extremely poor way of doing things. And what happens is in the late 17th century, Bengal is effectively attacked by a bunch of outsiders from the Arakanese, who are just across the other side of the delta. There's a whole bunch of pirates. They're aided by Portuguese and Dutch pirates. They're oppressed by the Mughal Empire, which is still trying to kind of exert its influence and kind of counterbalance the Arakanese a lot of the time. And so along the coastline, especially where you have all of these seaborne invaders effectively, especially the Arakanese, the Dutch in particular, a lot of it ends up being almost completely depopulated. The whole region becomes so impoverished that they resort to salt sleeching. Right? It's like the only thing they can really afford to do, especially given so many people are literally taken away as slaves, is that they can resort to salt sleeching. And unfortunately, when the British arrive in the 1760s, that is still very much in practice and has kind of become embedded in the way that things are done because the salt is taxed. And so because the salt is taxed, you end up with the existing methods of salt production becoming kind of entrenched by interest groups. When the British arrive, when Clive kind of sets up how he's going to run the kind of independent East India Company state for the first time, rather than just being a trading company, he is worried that the East India Company directors back in Britain aren't really paying them very well, and that the way that the East India Company servants, that is the staff, his soldiers, can get paid is by taking over the salt taxation and essentially creating a salt, and there's a couple of other goods as well, but salt is the main one, a salt monopoly with which to essentially fund this nascent East India Company state, which in many ways kind of, we mentioned earlier how you can go off into space or you can go off around the world and do your own thing, is exactly what's happening. Essentially, you have this monopoly set up. And unfortunately, over the next few decades, basically a period of about 100 years, so 1760s to the 1860s, when this is finally all gradually torn down, you have in Bengal a salt monopoly managed by the British, which upholds the use of salt sleeching in some of the most devastatingly difficult and dangerous circumstances imaginable. Because it doesn't sound that bad. It's like, oh, okay, I'm just going to go to the jungle, cut down some wood and make some salt. Big deal. But the jungles are horrific environments to work in. I mean, the sheer level of tiger deaths are just alone seem to be absolutely astronomical. Although I should mention that they are possibly inflated by the fact that people were running away and blaming it on the tigers. But it also, even that alone tells you it's like, it's so bad and dangerous that people are running away and everyone's blaming it on tigers. Just shows just how bad it is. And so people are effectively enslaved for the salt making season and then sent out to do this stuff by the kind of, the English officials, they outsource it to local officials, the zamindars they're called, who are effectively they're supposed to be the local lords or landlords. And the Zamindars find a way to basically get whatever labour they need for the salt sleeching, which is extremely difficult. It's essentially just through coercion, to the extent that if you're someone who has even lived next to a salt worker, you might be liable to be seized as a salt worker to work that whole, months at a time season in these horrific, humid, dangerous conditions. So it's one of the, what's actually really interesting about the whole case is that if you look at some of the, literature from the 80s, 90s in particular, literature about Indian industries, the English are blamed in the 1860s for having destroyed the Bengalese salt industry because they replaced it all with the Sampar Lake, which was, they used railways to take this stuff from the interior of the subcontinent to all of these other places that lacked salt, basically rationalising the whole system. But actually, I think it's the exact opposite, is that whole industry should never have existed in the first place. They should have been importing salt from other places. And the English are actually to blame for having blocked it for so long, because it was such an easy way to tax that province, which was otherwise so devastatingly poor, where, they thought it would be much easier to simply tax the salt than to try and, take the farmer's grain. And the way that you can get at the merchants and even the officials, so that at least even someone who's wealthy enough to not have to be a farmer still needs salt. And so it's your way of kind of getting at their revenue as well.
But presumably the other place you can get it is on the land tax, and then you have to put quite wealthy and influential people's noses out of joint, and you think, no, so much easier just to basically tax many, many, many poor people than to tax a few rich ones.
Absolutely. You see this even with, one of the interesting things is we actually have so much documentation about the administration of the salt tax. And a lot of it's quite mixed in its point of view. I mean, you really do see some officials who are appalled by what they're seeing, what they're having to manage, and trying to do things like abolish the kind of slave-like elements that they're doing, sometimes with perverse kind of effects or unintended consequences, where they do kind of put the noses of the Zamindars out of joint, and it ends up getting even worse because people find even worse workarounds, or they just lose all their workers. Who just flee to other bits. I mean, I even think that to a certain extent, and I wasn't quite able to actually fully confirm this, although I do mention it in the piece, which listeners can go and read in full for the full details, but it seems even as though that the expansion of the East India Company's empire in the subcontinent is in some ways kind of provoked by the fact that they keep failing to block salt from coming into Bengal. That every time they find another neighbouring bit where there's like Orissa, for example, Orissa they seem to conquer in the 1810s on the grounds that they keep smuggling so much salt in. They're like, well, if you're going to keep doing this, we're just going to take over the whole province, the whole region, just to kind of stop it going. To the extent that on the verge of it being abolished, you have this whole, the whole northeastern part of the continent, basically right down the entire subcontinent. You end up with a customs line, which in many parts isn't just kind of lots of stations where people will tax the salt as it comes in, but literally this kind of gigantic hedge that keeps people out. It appears to be one of, I mean, it's not the whole line isn't just a hedge, but a lot of it seems to be this extremely thick, impenetrable hedge, created just for this kind of completely arbitrary, almost bureaucratically self-serving, self-perpetuating regime.
Yeah, well, it's actually that part of your piece. I mean, the whole piece, and you talk about a whole bunch of other stuff. We've come, because you've derailed us so often, Anton. We haven't had a chance to talk, but there's so much in the piece on salt, and do go and read it, everybody, because it's absolutely fascinating. But that's one of the most depressing bits, and not just because it's the British that come out of it looking particularly guilty. It is just a very depressing story, that. Okay, well, look, I don't know, are there any other highways and byways, either on salt or on any other unrelated matters you'd like to take us down, or have we reached an ending?
There is actually one thing that I would like to get off my chest, which I haven't written about because it would take so long for me to do, but I really hope some researcher will go and look into this properly, which is that I mentioned this very offhand earlier, that I think a lot of states formed around salt deposits. And I think you really see this with Germany, right? The reason Germany, I think, isn't unified for much of its medieval and early modern history right up until, the late 19th century is, I think, because there are so many salt mines, so many salt springs dotted around all over the place, that you don't get this kind of natural state forming like you do just a little bit further west in France, right? In France, you've got a bit in the kind of the bits just to the east of so the actual traditional borders of France are quite a bit ways west of where they are today. So you have the saline, the salt-producing springs just to the east of that, around Strasbourg and so on and so forth. But otherwise, French salt production is based in the salt marshes of the southeast, around Marseille. Marseille. And then you've got the southwestern ones in kind of what used to be the Duchy of Aquitaine, Ile de Ré and Oléron, and kind of all these that kind of region. So not only producing the wine, which it's so famous for, but also Bordeaux wine, but also essentially Bordeaux salt production. And so if you can control those, you effectively get to control the entire interior of France as well, because everything beyond those river systems that's fed by that salt is essentially controlled from the coastline. And if you look at French history, you see this with even the French Wars of Religion. I think there are so many of them. I think there's 8 French Wars of Religion over the course of the 1560s to 90s. Because every time the Protestants decide to declare something on the Catholics, literally the first thing they go and do is seize the salt supplies. And whenever they have a bad war, or a bad uprising, it seems to be because they've lost control of the salt supplies. And whenever they've got a good one, it's because they've seized the salt supplies and they've sold it all to the Dutch or the English for ready cash. Not just the existing stockpile, but the next year or 2 years of salt production as well. So that seems to be, I think, something that, the way that it defines France, I think also in the contrast defines Germany, in that you have so many different little places that each have their own little salt supply, that there's naturally no really big states that form like that, with a few interesting exceptions, like, for example, the dominance of the Habsburgs over Bohemia. The moment they get Bohemia, they basically never lose the thing again. So Bohemia being, for listeners, modern-day Czechia, what used to be the Czech Republic. Bohemia doesn't have any salt production of its own, and for ages it's basically dominated by the Habsburgs based in Austria, who are, by the way, salt producers. And they really, I think, they block all competing salt sources as much as they can from that region. And the other interesting thing about Germany is that you end up with places, even if they don't produce salt, because there's lots of salt producers around them that they can source their salt from, that they can maintain their independence because they can just kind of play off their rivals against one another, which is I think roughly what happens in Switzerland, which doesn't really have that many salt supplies, but can source it from the Austrians, from the Bavarians, from a bunch of other people as well.
And you've got no one person who's getting all the taxes, which then allows them to dominate, because you've got so many different sources of salt. There's no source of tax revenue which sort of kind of crushes everybody else under their foot.
Exactly, because it's not just taxed by the producers, it's often taxed even if you're a ruler of a country that has no salt, but it's very easy to tax it as it comes into the country, which, for example, is what happens with Piedmont-Savoy, is that the Dukes of Piedmont-Savoy, I think they maintain this pretty large state for quite a while, just because the Duke can tax the stuff that's coming from the Mediterranean as it comes into the kind of more alpine regions, which otherwise are completely dependent on that.
Well, I'll give you an example of how much more advanced the Chinese were than the people of Czechia or Piedmont. They came up with a brilliant idea to evade the tax, which is that they sowed chili on the roadsides. And chili is kind of the poor man's salt. So a lot of Chinese cooking uses chilies instead of salt because salt is taxed, or was taxed, and was very expensive. But chilies picked from the roadside, completely free.
So it does have natural salts in it. Something it has.
I don't think it gives you the medicinal side of things. It doesn't. It's not giving you what you need for your health, but it is giving you what you need for your taste.
Well, and I guess the preservation perhaps a bit as well. There might be something.
Maybe, I don't know. I got that from Jonathan Clements, who wrote a kind of a history of China through its cuisine, and apparently this was the case in 700 AD or something, that chilies became quite a thing because they were trying not to buy the heavily taxed salt.
That's interesting. One thing I haven't looked into as much is actually China's taxation of salt, because they also have a monopoly, a government monopoly on salt. again, it's just one of those things that states seem to form around salt. It's the easiest thing to tax. So,
yeah, well, Jonathan always says that he's a technological determinist, but it's kind of interesting. There are these sort of hidden forces which are at work, and the great men of history sort of sit on top of them. But it's maybe it's the sources of salt, or whether or not you've worked out how to build a cannon that can fire a cannonball that bit further because the metallurgy is that much better. That's what really determines the course of history, which I guess is your whole project to some extent.
Yeah, although weirdly, I don't think of myself as that much of a technological determinist, but I do. When I notice the little links like that, I think, okay, I think there's some of the patterns are set by this stuff. Like, it definitely kind of creates the geography that people are having to operate within. But actually, I'd say overall, one of my big themes of my project is that you can really turn around a losing hand, which I think is exactly what happened to England in the 1540s. That it's possible to go from a pretty bad state of affairs to something that's truly extraordinary.
That's a great place to end it. So let's end it there. I will just say that...
Yeah, go on. This is going to be this is going to be in the extras. This
is going to be the extras. But, I mean, you say England was hopeless. I mean, apart from about, I don't know, whether it was 40 years during the war against France, the 100 Years' War, utterly feeble. And even during the 100 Years' War, France is incomparably the richer, more cultured, more influential state. And it is just extraordinary how England suddenly, after 1,000 years or more of being an absolute backwater, sort of springs out and becomes what it does.
Yeah. I mean, I go even further. I actually worked this out for the book, which is that England goes from being about a quarter the size of France, not counting Aquitaine, right? So not counting the French possessions, which I'm not sure how it will affect the balance, but obviously better than a quarter, to being less than an eighth the size of France in the 16th century. And the main reason for that is after the Black Death, England's population really stagnates for about 150 years, whereas everywhere else in Europe grows. It's shocking.
This is something I don't completely understand. I'm going to ask, hopefully ask somebody about it. I want to do something on the 100 Years' War. Is how the hell did society keep going? I mean, something like half of France die, a third of England die. I just don't understand how the whole thing doesn't. I mean, how can they keep wars going? How can they keep trade going? How they can keep anything going with that going on around them is just completely mysterious to me.
Yeah, and almost barely merits comment at the time as well. Like, they mentioned everyone died. Oh well, guess we keep the war going.
Okay, let's end it there. Anton, thank you very much indeed. That was terrific.
Thanks for a great conversation.